Tonight, we are here to have a conversation with Chris Joyner. And for those of you who are not familiar, or even for those of you who are, I'm going to make you hear it again anyway. Chris is an investigative reporter with the AJC, and he's has more than 2 decades worth of experience in journalism. It ranges from community newspapers to national and international news and wire services. He did report from the scene of Hurricane Katrina in 2005 and the Deepwater Horizon oil spill in 2010. As an investigative reporter, he focuses on uncovering hidden communities and has written about street gangs and life inside a supermax prison, the hidden world of government lobbying, and a white-collar criminal network built around a drug testing lab, which all sounds very deep and very interesting. And we could probably have a whole conversation about the things that he's had to investigate and talk about, but we have other things to talk about. So Chris, come on up and we'll get started.
Welcome. Thanks for having me. Yeah, thank you for having me, Zach.
We're very, very happy to be here. We were having a conversation beforehand about how long of a road it was to get you onto the screen due to publication delays and everything, because we were originally talking about last September, but your book, The 3 Death Sentences of Clarence Henderson, highly recommend. It got delayed from September to January and kind of put the kibosh on a lot of things you had going on, but you got it out. It's been out for 4 months now, and something in that range. Mm-hmm. Don't check my math. And but we definitely want to be able to cover some ground on that, but also we want to talk about research. And one of the things that I'm just going to jump right into it here. So one of the things that I get asked a lot, or commonly asked at these programs, actually there's 2 questions. One is the writer's journey. They want to hear about the writer's journey. And the second one is related to the book that they happen to be talking about. And it's always like, well, how did you get your idea? Because everybody wants to know where to find that factory. And but as it happens, both of those questions kind of intersect for you, don't they?
Yeah, they really do. And my journey is, for this book is really a long one. It started when I started in journalism in the late 1990s. And my first newspaper job was at the newspaper in Carrollton, Georgia, the Times Georgian, where I was a general assignment reporter. And then within relatively short order, I was a features editor as a small community newspaper. So you could move up quickly as long as you didn't ask for a raise. But I had come to journalism, I'd sort of come in journalism through the side door. I'd been training to be a historian. My degrees are in history. And, when I decided I wasn't going to do that anymore, I needed to find, paying work, and journalism was something that did interest me. So I was able to get in there. I had gone as an undergraduate to West Georgia College, now University of West Georgia, but at the time West Georgia College. And so I was coming back to Carrollton for that job. My father and my mother had both gone to West Georgia College in the 1940s. And not long after I started working at the newspaper, my father had said, not long after he had graduated, he said that there was a boy named Buddy Stevens that he knew casually who had been shot to death. And he said that was a big deal when it happened. He said, I don't think they ever figured out who did it. He said, you should look in the archives and see, what that story's about. And one day I did. I pulled down a big bound copy of what was then known as the Georgian and found the date of the murder. And it was, it was like, Hindenburg crashes or World at War. I mean, the size of the headline just jumped off at me because it was such a shocking event for this community when Buddy Stevens was killed. And, so I got into the book that way. Immediately it struck me as like, this is a really, sort of like meaty topic. As I started turning the pages and then spending weekends in libraries looking at microfilm of other newspaper coverage, I got really sort of drawn into it that way. spent really, close to a couple of years just gathering information, taking, in my free time, Xeroxes of newspaper printouts, and then, printouts from microfilm for various other newspapers, and taking them home and carefully organizing them into notebooks, and then eventually putting those notebooks in a closet when I got a job at another newspaper. And so all that research, that initial research I did, just moved with me from newspaper to newspaper as I went to Tennessee and Mississippi, and then eventually back here to Atlanta, where I started work for the AJC. And it was actually during, a couple of years into, well, really about 5 years into my work at the AJC, it occurred to me that, I had this great story I'd never really done anything with. And now I'm back sort of in an area where I could sort of pick it back up again, and pulled down that research and, opened up a file in my laptop and, started writing, and realized, oh, I have so much more to do. I thought as a young reporter in my 20s, I had everything I needed to write a book. But as a, more seasoned reporter and a more seasoned person generally, I realized, there's a lot more that I had to do.
Yeah.
So that's sort of like that's sort of the journey, how I got to writing the first words of the of the book.
Yeah. It's kind of interesting because, having your research sitting in a closet like that is very much like that manuscript that is written and shelved away because either it's not finished or anything like that, and it just kind of haunts you and talks to you and waits on you, and then you eventually got to a point where you're able to get going with it again.
Absolutely. It was sort of in a way, it was really sort of the roadblock to writing anything else. Like there's a story that I needed to deal with before I could move on to anything else of, outside of my newspaper writing, of course.
Yeah, I would, it's interesting because, actually I'm gonna jump ahead of where I wanted to be right now, but this book, it really reads a lot like a true crime podcast, and the narrative is very full of story, is very character driven. There's so many characters that are in here, and it's so interesting to see how you take something that's a part of you, for so long, and have turned it into this type of story, where it could be a work of fiction and the characters are likable and dislikable. They're all over the place, and it comes from a time where it's very easy because of the politics and everything at the time. But I'm curious, are you a fan of these podcasts? Or because it just has that structure to it that
in my initial research, I really saw the beats of the story. The main narrative arc of the story was pretty clear to me when I did my initial research, because for those of you who are not familiar with the book, Buddy Stevens' murder is the very beginning of the book, but what follows is a manhunt and then a series of trials as they try to pin the murder on a black sharecropper. Buddy Stevens being a young white boy, they try to pin it on Clarence Henderson, sharecropper in that community, whose connection with the crime is entirely built around the idea that he had at one point owned a gun they believed had been used in the murder. And so I saw, it was pretty clear to me where the beats in the story were, how the story, the narrative arc, how it would progress. But, I needed more than that, I think, to actually take on the project. And I was actually listening to that first season of Serial, the podcast about a wrongfully convicted man in Maryland in a murder. And, like everybody else during that period, it was a phenomena, and I was listening to it. But I was really sort of like deconstructing, what is it about Serial that has so many people interested in it? And it occurred to me it was that the storytelling was both deep and it was wide. They were going really deep into a case that frankly none of us knew anything about, and had no natural connection to. It happened in Maryland. It happened in the 90s. But they would go so deep into the granular details of it that it would really draw you in. And then they would also go wide in talking about the larger community and the context of that story. And it really occurred to me at the time, and it was the impetus for me to start writing, was, oh, I've got that kind of story where I have lots of detail about the crime and the trials, but I've also always thought of it in terms of its greater context of the America of the late 1940s, early 1950s, this post-World War II period. And I really saw a lot of the action in the main narrative being driven by these sort of like broader forces in America during that period. And so, yeah, I do, in short answer, I do listen to those, but serial, its storytelling approach was I think really influential to me.
Yeah. I was fascinated by it. I mean, granted, I admittedly watch a lot of true crime documentaries, and Netflix always has serial killer documentaries. And no, I'm not one, but I am very much interested in the psychology of it, and also the investigative side of it. And it was interesting as I was reading just the number of people that they bounced from, this suspect to this suspect to this, all for very loose reasons that may or may not have even had any basis in fact. And I'm curious, as I was reading that, I was curious, like, how, when you're reporting that in, or recording that into the story, where is that particular information drawn from?
So I was very fortunate in terms of this story that I had a great wealth of contemporary sources, mostly newspapers, but not exclusively. The newspapers at the time were very competitive. Carrollton, a relatively small town, had two newspapers that were competing against each other, as well as the Atlanta Journal and the Atlanta Constitution, which were separate papers at the time. And then, of course, national publications as well. So there were lots of different perspectives I could draw on. Then also, during that period, there were African-American led newspapers, the Atlanta Daily World or the Pittsburgh Courier or the Chicago Defender. And they had an entirely different perspective on the case. And so I had all that information, and that was really my starting point in terms of sort of like the broad strokes in the narrative. But it also, you could mine those for details that would help sort of color the narrative, flesh it out, make it seem real. Sometimes, from the newspaper sense, things that didn't even, on their face seem to relate directly to the crime or to the, to the courtroom action. Like I can remember, that in looking at, the pages, I would always read through that newspaper where there was a big event to see sort of what else is happening sort of contemporaneous that would give me a sense of what the vibe was like during the, say during a big trial. And, often I was able to find stories that would sort of give me a sense of what's going on in the broader community, whether it was the establishment of a new, sort of middle-class residential area, or something like, two boys win, a state award for growing potatoes. All those things place the action in a real context and give the story sort of a lived-in feel.
Sure. Yeah. A reminder to everybody who's here that, or even on Facebook, that if you have any questions for us, please do make them known here in the Zoom room. You've got the Q&A function at the bottom center of your screen. Just click it and add your question in. I'll be happy to get to them at any point in time. If you're on Facebook, throw your question on there and we'll get to it if we can. Thank you. It's interesting. You had talked a bit about the process of the story and how it sat in a closet and all this time passed and everything. Um, but despite that, it's funny. I was in reading your preface. I mean, I feel like I could ask an hour's worth of questions just from the preface alone because you really dig into, the whole process and the passage of time and everything. But the interesting thing to me, the thing that struck me there is that despite that time going by, it still had a relentless feel to it in your approach to this story and the research aspect of it. And I'm curious if you could, and this is a difficult question, I don't know, but if you could whittle your approach to research down to one rule or a bit of advice for writers, what would it be?
Um, I would say that, if you're approaching a nonfiction topic, or even if you want to, even a fiction topic that you want to make, realistic, when you're looking at your primary source material, that's your research material. In this case, for instance, I had newspaper coverage and court documents. Those were the bulk of my primary documents. Use those as launching off places. Don't use them as an endpoint. I had, court transcripts that provided me with a lot of the dialogue that's in the book, and they're essential particularly for moving along the courtroom scenes. But they would also in there include, would raise questions as I was reading them. I would, there would be a question that I would wonder, well, how in the world would they know even to ask that question? And then where might I be able to find the answer to that? And sometimes it is, I'm trying to think of a good example from the book. One might be, there is a point where the Communist Party of the United States has gotten involved in the defense of the man who's put on trial, Clarence Henderson. And the judge takes a really extraordinary approach, calling in members of the Communist Party, people who were actively involved in raising money for his defense, into his courtroom to hold them in contempt for actions taken outside of his courtroom. Generally a judge might hold someone in contempt if they're disruptive or if they're doing something inside the courtroom. But he had them essentially summoned by the police to come to his courtroom for actions that they were doing exclusively in Atlanta. And I thought, well, that's, and I had that information from the newspaper, and I had, some court documents that showed that, but I was like, why is this going on as it is? And I started branching out and looking, well, what's going on in Carrollton, what's going on in Atlanta or Georgia, and what's going on even in a broader sense. And there were, in that case, a couple of things. The Korean War had just broken out. So the issue of fighting communism was a very real issue. And that sent me back into the newspapers, the local newspapers, to see what was happening. And, people were getting drafted. Reservists were being called up. So, families were, sending their kids to war again, just shortly after World War II, really. And I looked in the national publications to see what was going on there. And there were, this was a period when the Red Scare was coming up, and there was a big trial of communists in New York during that same period. And so all those, I could have just told the story of the court hearing and what went on, and that's, it was an extraordinary hearing. But by using that as a jumping off spot and casting my net a little wider and going back to other sources, I was able to place it in, I think, a context where this judge's sort of extraordinary behavior makes a little more sense.
Yeah, it's interesting because this story, it takes place. I mean, Carroll County was not large at that time. I think you actually listed the census data, and it was a few thousand people. It wasn't very big at all. But yet this whole story winds up, Communist Party and Thurgood Marshall, and I mean, it's just the directions that it goes, the web that it spins is really broad, which leads me to my next question, which is, you have all this research. Okay, so this book it's a little bit less than 300 pages, and you have, I don't know how many notebooks of information. If it's a physical thing or a virtual thing, I have no idea.
It's a
But
little
it's a
of
lot.
both, but I have these are my original notebooks from the '90s that I had placed in a closet for a long time, and they were by subject matter. And when I picked it up and started branching off and really fleshing out the research, there's a lot of material that was available to me online that hadn't been when I first started. But I would still often rely on, paper records. So I would have multiple notebooks open up as I was writing, all say to March 14th, 1951, in that time frame, so I could, while I was writing about one thing, see what was going on, nationally, what was going on in the local newspapers, at the same time as I was working from, say, a court transcript, just so I would have all that in front of me, so I could sort of broaden it out. But so yeah, it was a mixture of paper records and more digital records as I went along.
Yeah. So you have all this information. How do you decide what to use and what not to use?
Mm-hmm. That was in some ways that's a really difficult question for me, because particularly when I got my hands on the trial transcripts, you could geek out on those forever, into the most minute detail. And I go pretty deep on some of them. For instance, ballistics testimony and things like that, which I think are key to understanding what was going on during that period. I could have written actually a lot more on. But I think, my training as a journalist there really pays off. I've written for a newspaper audience for, more than 20 years at this point. And so I really think about my writing in terms of its service to the reader, and so I'm always sort of focused on what carries the reader from one place to another. And at what point am I sort of derailing and going into something solely because I'm geeking out on it? I had a funny story. When I was a reporter in Jackson, Mississippi, we would have authors come into the newsroom when they were out on book tours, and there was a good independent bookstore in Jackson, Mississippi that was a stopping point for a lot of people who were doing a Southern swing. And Elmore Leonard came in. And he had written a book with his son, and so they were out selling this book, and they came in to talk about writing with the reporters. And we got to the point where we were asking questions, and I said, when you're writing, what do you think you owe the reader when you're writing? And Elmore Leonard said, I don't know, the reader's a goddamn thing. And that's the way he approached it. And he said, what do you think and he turned it around on me. He said, what do you think you owe readers? And I said, well, I just think it's a different art form. But it's just a different way of looking at things. I think for me, I really tried to just keep my eye on that ball, so that I didn't go too far away from where I thought the narrative arc of the story was going, and where I didn't bog readers down too much.
Kind of lead into one of the questions we have, which is listed by Scatterbrain, and I feel you, Scatterbrain. That's about where I'm at. First question is, how did you take your pile of notes and begin writing that pile of spaghetti into chapters or acts?
Well, I think what I did was I took I took a piece of paper, and I was not meticulous in like charting out chapters, mainly because I was more interested in seeing whether I could actually, finally write this piece. But I did take some paper and I sat down and I started mapping out where I thought the beats in the story were. Where are the natural points. And in, and there are a lot of ways you could have done it. And mine is, it follows a timeline. And so I followed that timeline from, in my case, for my book, it was from murder to manhunt to arrest. And then I have 3 trials. Mm-hmm. And so that's sort of like the compact, beats. As I got into actually writing out those chapters, I thought about what it was I needed to accomplish to make the people in the story real. And what I decided on was that I would use breaks in between those beats for chapters that talked about the characters. And so between trials, I would have stories about who, the communists and who they were, and the particular fights that they got involved with. Before the second trial, I had an entire chapter that introduced the primary defense attorney, sort of the face of the defense, and I would use those as ways to sort of cement these characters in their time, make them real, and place them in context. But I also felt like it provided the reader from a little bit of a break, from what would otherwise be sort of like a procedural book, and I didn't really want to write that. I also took a whole chapter to just talk about one of the most important characters in the book, which was the place. And
that is something I definitely want to be able to get you. So I
mm-hmm.
I guess I'll just go ahead and run right with it then. You do a good bit of history. The Carol kind of right in the beginning of the book, you take us all the way back to the days of the Creek and Cherokee Indian tribes and the move west in the newly formed state of Georgia, and the difficulties that arise in those confrontations. And then you move us forward through time with Carroll County, and we see the development of this county becoming into what it is for the story. And in doing so, you did make it a central character in this entire story. And I feel like you were going there with it, but what led you to that?
And it was a little bit of a controversial choice with my beta readers. But I really felt that, if I had written this book, if I had picked a similar event in Los Angeles or New York or Chicago, then maybe a whole chapter about Chicago, wouldn't be required. But mm-hmm. in the case of some place that no one had ever heard of, or at least didn't know in any sort of depth, I felt like Carrollton needed, again, to make the story live, really needed to be a fully fleshed out character in the book. And so I decided that it needed to be an early chapter unto itself. What I sacrificed for that was taking the reader out of the narrative arc for 16 pages or so. But I felt like I could get away with it. Particularly when I said, okay, well, what do I need to know about Carrollton? And so I started pulling primary and secondary sources. So there happened to be a good county history, I was very fortunate to be able to go on. There was a bad county history, which was also useful in its own way. Mm-hmm. And I went to the archives of the University of West Georgia, and and that's one thing I did throughout the whole thing is I was like, okay, well, where are the records that will give me this fulsome picture of whatever it was I was interested in. And in the case of Carrollton, I was like, well, they have a historical society, but their records were mostly genealogical, and that wasn't so much what I was looking for. But the academic institution, the university, had done oral histories of people who were important in the community. They had papers that had been donated to the university, including from the original president of the university. They had some court records that weren't even in the courthouse anymore, of early trials, like 19th century trials and early 20th century trials. And so I made time and went to Carrollton, spent some time with the lovely archivist there in the library. I went through the president's annual reports to the Board of Regents, which gave me a flair for, feeling for what that life on the university campus was like at the time. There were clippings and writings, letters back and forth between people. All those things sort of gave me, along with the secondary sources like the county histories, a real feel for, how I could write about that character that was Carrollton and Carroll County.
Yeah, I won't speak for your beta readers, but I personally enjoyed it because I love the history, but also I feel like it was an important, at least there was one bit in there that I thought was an important bit of information. Is like, despite the fact that through the era of slave labor, the state of Georgia, I believe you said, was 40% Black at that time, that Carroll County itself was 80% white, I believe was the number.
Yeah.
It was something ridiculous because he didn't have the farming land. And so therefore, though you have a lot of the traditional elements of the South as we know it that would lead to, this type of racial injustice, it wasn't quite the same county as every other county in
Right.
Georgia.
And it's really part of my thesis about the case as to why it broke the way it did. Is that Carrollton is in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. If you've been out in West Georgia, the land's very hilly. It's piney. It's not suited to industrial agriculture. And so in its founding, it never was a great slaveholding area. And as a result, it had, pretty soft Confederate sentiment. It was a Union holdout in the Confederate conventions that led to the Civil War. And it always had a sort of different character from the rest of the state in that way. It was more moderate, although certainly racist, more moderate on the idea of race than the surrounding area. And so while race was driving the investigation and the prosecution of Clarence Henderson, in some areas of the state, Clarence Henderson might have never seen the inside of a courthouse. It might not have gotten that far. Carrollton saw itself and forever had seen itself as a more progressive, striving community. Saw almost, without any sort of evidence that it would become something, better than a frontier town. And so I always thought that was an important part of why that narrative went the way it did. And that was replicated in a lot of places around the United States. Not every place was Mississippi burning. There were gradations of that. And while Milwaukee might be a terribly racist place, or Levittown, New Jersey might be a terribly racist place, it behooves you as a researcher and a writer to understand, okay, but to what level and how do local characteristics factor into that? Right. And in that case, it was, it was agriculture, it was population, it was, to some degree, political leadership. All those things mattered when it came to understanding that story.
Okay. I'm going to have a question sitting there from our attendees, but before we get to that one, I am gonna run into a highly technical question here about the process of writing nonfiction. What is the purpose and function and importance of footnotes?
Also sort of a controversial choice, and it's probably my my training in history. I have a master's degree in American history, and I did work on my PhD in history. So I spent a lot of time with footnotes, and also sort of as a newspaper reporter, I have I want things to be true. I want them to be known to be true, and careful documentation, I think, is one way that you can say that, particularly when you have a story like mine, where some of it is sort of outrageous to modern eyes. I think the footnotes, whether you did them, however you did the notations, the notes are a signal to the reader. I know this sounds crazy, but it is actually true. So, in that sense, I felt like it was important to carefully document what I had done.
Which I feel, though, an element of writing nonfiction is probably more strictly tied to your journalistic roots and in wanting to verify and have sources for information.
I mean, I am a guy who will read a nonfiction book, and if it starts out, the guy walked down the street, I will say, well, how do I know that? It's, I do want it to feel real. And for those of us that do write nonfiction, whether it's in newspapers or whether it's long form, we know there are stories that in our industry that we can look at where an allegedly nonfiction piece came under great scrutiny and didn't survive. And I did not. And I think that's a cautionary tale. Now, does that mean you have to have, notations and, minor end notes, but the book is filled with number 6 and note 6, and you can go back and you can look. And I did have one of my editors said, well, how do you feel about that? And I was like, well, I know that not everybody does it, but I think that I'd rather have it.
Question from the attendees we have: is the story mostly narrative, or did you create dialogue to develop your characters and move the plot?
So I didn't feel like I could create dialogue. I mean, and I understand, that there's some people. I'm not gonna tar everybody and say that's an impossibility. You can't create dialogue and call it nonfiction. I did not. It is told in a narrative fashion. I didn't want it to feel academic. I didn't want it to feel like a polemic lesson about justice. I wanted it to be a good story because I'm in the process. I'm in the business of telling stories first. But when it came to dialogue, I was very fortunate that I had trial transcripts. I had to make some decisions, and some of these were based on the quality of the documents that I had. For instance, one of the transcripts I was working from had been prepared in such a way that for appeal, that it did not include the questions that were being asked of witnesses, and rephrased part of the witness's answers to include the question. When I realized that was going on, I would take out the part that I felt like the witness didn't really say, and I would generally paraphrase the prosecutor or the defense attorney's question rather than as a direct quote. I would take that part of the transcript and I would paraphrase it, and then I'd use the direct quote as the answer. So I did have to make some, concessions. Some other things that I did, there's a lot of courtroom action that does not show up in the transcript. And that is, I sweated it out as to how I was going to deal with that. And I base my decision to write, that, Attorney Dan Duke stood up and pointed at the witness. That's not in the transcript, but I have covered many, many trials. And I know what courtroom action looks like. And I can tell sometimes from how annoyed the judge is about what's going on. Also, though, I talked to the surviving child of the defense attorney to get a sense of Dan Duke's personality. That would help me decide, how to proceed, in describing his behavior, his physical behavior. And I also leaned on some of his prior escapades. He was a very volatile person. When it came to the solicitor, the district attorney, essentially, in the case, I had an idea of what he was like as a person. And so I tried to make his actions to be, following on his statements to be as, close to his personality as I could muster.
Yeah. Well, we have a little bit less than 15 minutes to go. So if you all have any more questions for us, throw them in here. I have plenty, but would love to be able to hear some of your questions. And we're going to kind of dive back into research here. And obviously, it's really interesting because, we looked at your notebooks versus what you may have on your computer now. The times have changed. Information is so much more available than it used to be. So if a writer is looking to do research for a book or even a story, where is, in your opinion, the best place for them to start?
Well, I think that the first thing you've got to have, particularly if you're doing nonfiction, is you've got to make sure before you get deeply into a topic that you've got the documents to back it up, or the human sources, depending upon what it is. If you're going to write a biography, did that person keep lots of records and donate them to a university? Is that person, if that person's still alive, is that person going to cooperate in helping you tell that person's story, or their heirs or descendants? Having that sort of like baseline bulk of material is important. Then you have to start then. So what's the next layer of material I'm going to draw from, or what are the secondary sources? For me, it was there was a great book about sundown towns that gave me a sense of what highly segregated towns were like during the 1950s. There were FBI. I drew a lot on FBI files of some people, and those are available in an easier way now than ever before, because a lot of FBI files of notable people are online. I think following that thread of, okay, well, where are my records? Where are my documents? Where are my secondary sources? You gather all that material. If you don't think that you can muster the material, you're probably going to have a hard time writing the book. Now, if you're writing realistic fiction, then you can draw from even broader sources. You can, but the way it's so much easier for me now than when I first started was, for instance, I was doing some research and some pre-writing on the defense team that was assembled for the second of the three trials, and there was a mention in the Atlanta Daily World newspaper that they were hired by the NAACP, and I was like, when I read that, it was one line in the story. I was like, well, the NAACP, big national organization, they keep records. Where are the NAACP's records from the 1950s? Google search later, I find, well, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund's records are in the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. An hour later, I had booked a flight and a cheap hotel, and a week later, I was sitting in the reading room in the Library of Congress, where they've, the very nice archivist, brought me everything I needed whole files on this case, a lot dealing with billing because they were attorneys, they wanted to know how they were getting paid, but also memos back and forth as they were trying to get, so that kind of thing would have been a really heavy lift for me as a person who has a day job. I might have looked at that line and said, oh, the NAACP has records. Well, I guess I'm going to go to the state archives and see if the state NAACP records are there, or I'm going to look in a catalog. I'll have to go to the main branch of the Atlanta Public Library and look in a catalog of archival resources and find out where the NAACP records are. Now, all that would have taken time that, frankly, it was a snap. Like I say, within a few hours, I was planning on going to Washington, D.C. Because I'd already found the NAACP records, which had a finding aid. There was a finding aid online that I was able to search and found Clarence Henderson's name in the finding aid. It was I was amazed at how much easier it was. Same thing with a lot of other characters. I was, for the communist organizer, I did a variety of different sort of searches to discover that there was a self-published book that it was written about, the communist organizer and his family, and was able to order it off Amazon. So all these things have become much more available and simpler for people who start their work on their side project at 9 p.m. instead of 9 a.m.
Right. Another question from the audience. How did you decide how to organize the materials in the notebooks? What subject headings, for examples, did you use, or groupings?
So I decided I was going to organize the newspaper clippings. And I went broad. So I was copying things that directly related to the case, and things that did not relate at all, but that I thought might be useful down the road for context. And this is a lot of material that material in particular, relating to your earlier question, a lot of that doesn't make it into the book, but it informed the book. And what I ended up doing was I would organize, and this is one of the notebooks, and I've got about a dozen. And this one is organized into, there's a section on the investigation. There's a section on an initial suspect who is not Clarence Henderson. There is a section that is solely about the judge, and the judge being a really important figure in that community. I've got about 10 years worth of clippings about that judge, and, only, and really none of these deal with the action of the book, but they gave me an idea of the, his importance in the community, sort of all the things that he was involved with, his background and things like that. I have other books that deal solely with race relations during the time, drawn from a bunch of different newspapers, the NAACP, information I was able to get on the defense attorneys. So I had those all topically organized, and then I had them inside those sections. I had them linear, in a timeline. And so, like I say, when I sat down to write, and I was like, well, tonight I'm dealing with, this topic, I'm at this stage in a trial, or I'm at this point in the narrative, and I would have all those open up around me to that time period. One would be my primary source, and the others would be ones I would refer to as I was writing. That's not going to work for everybody, but that's how it worked for me.
I'm curious now. I know as a writer what I use for this method, but now that you don't have to keep them in notebooks and photocopy things and everything, what is your electronic go-to? Do you have a program you use, or are you just strictly a folders on the computer kind of guy?
No, I started with folders on a computer, and it was a nightmare. I ended up using Scrivener on the advice of a friend, which I found both cheap and effective. So those were two things that was like,
that honestly ought to just be the quotes for their slogan: cheap and effective.
yep.
It is a great program if you're looking for a program that you can both write within and keep all of your research in. That thing, it's wonderful.
And if I were to go back and do it again, I put a scans of a bunch of primary records into Scrivener. If I could go back and do it again, I would have, like I have for my journalism setup, I'd have two screens going, and I have, I would split it that way. That would have been very useful.
Yeah, absolutely. We have a few minutes left. So we've got to try to get through a couple questions here anyway. And I'm curious, you had mentioned primary and secondary material. So again, a technical question. What is secondary material versus primary material, and how is it important in research and storytelling?
So primary material would be things like court records, newspaper articles written at the time, archival papers, those kind of things. Secondary material would be books written by historians about the 1950s, biographies written about individuals by other people. Essentially other people's work about that period. So I read, lots of histories about not only about the South, but also about the 50s and about race relations during that period. And I read a book about, a very good history about what it was like for GIs returning home from World War II, because that was informing sort of that period. The county history that I referred to for Carroll County is a secondary source. It was written in the 1970s about how the county developed. So those are my secondary sources. Primary sources are from that time, original documents from that time, and secondary sources pretty much everything else.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you. Mm-hmm. Normally, I want to end a talk by asking, like, what book are you working on now? But because you have the added AJC thing, I would like to ask, what are you working on for the AJC that's big for you? And secondly, are you working on another book right now, or do you have anything planned?
So with the AJC, I'm on the investigative team, and for those folks who subscribe or think about subscribing, we have an extremely robust investigative team. We have 8 investigative reporters. Probably not going to find that in a lot of major city newspapers, because we're super expensive. We don't write enough, and we tend to be older, so we're expensive. So one of the things that I've been doing, I cover a lot of political stuff. One of the things that I've been doing for the past, since 2015, really, I've been writing about fringe political movements, extremists, hate groups, and things like that. And starting in 2015, I began to notice that far right groups had become increasingly organized and were moving out of chat rooms and into the public sphere. And I thought that was a very interesting and important development, and something that we needed to pay attention to. So I write about that, both from the right and the left. In fact, I had a story in Sunday's paper about a revolutionary sort of neo-Marxist group that is operating out of Atlanta. Its headquarters is in Atlanta, and you might run into them downtown a lot. They are kind of a nuisance group, but also, potentially dangerous. So I wrote about them. I also write about campaign finance, particularly at the federal level. So these tremendously expensive House and Senate seats that are coming up this year will be breaking all sorts of fundraising records, and I look at that data to try to figure out sort of who's giving and why. So that's what I do broadly for the AJC. And I am looking, at another book project. One of the characters in the book that I'm very fond of, in part because he is not a perfect person, is the the white defense attorney, a man named Dan Duke, who
Mm-hmm.
I write in the book, I believe I write in the book, I certainly said it enough, that in another, I don't know, sort of an alternate reality, he could have been governor of the state of Georgia. Might have, should have been. He certainly had the ambition, but he was sort of out of step with his times. He was, he saw segregation as being a moral wrong. He believed that justice should be blind to race, and he would take on cases for the NAACP that other white attorneys wouldn't do. And he paid a price for it. His political career was largely sidelined. He had a distinguished career both as an attorney and later as a judge. So, I mean, it's not like he was a failure in life, but it occurred to me, we don't talk about these people very much in talking about the history of the South. We tend to tell the history of the South through the eyes of segregationist governors or Klansmen, but not about the minority voices who, for every Talmadge, there was somebody who ran against them. And who are those people and what are their stories? I think that it's what I'd like to do is I'm sort of structuring a book around those stories of people who were out of step with their time, and also why they failed to convince their countrymen that there was another alternate path for the South that would have saved us from the stresses of the civil rights movement. As heroic as the civil rights movement was, ultimately it would have been better if segregationists hadn't existed. If the South's leaders had listened to their constituents, black and some white, and said, "Oh yeah, this is not in keeping with our American ideals." So I'm thinking, I'm scoping out a book that tells the South story through these minority voices, and and they're largely unsuccessful life stories.
Right. Excellent. Well, that gives us something to look forward to. If you have not read The Three Death Sentences of Clarence Henderson, I do highly recommend it, and it is widely available. We always encourage people to check with your local independent bookstores. In Atlanta, there's a number of them, including Acapella Books, which I know you've worked with closely. And definitely give it a look. It's not only I think an important story, but certainly from a historical standpoint of Georgia, but it's also it's incredibly well written, and it is told as a wonderful. We have a wonderful grip on storytelling, is what I'm trying to say. It was very well done.
Well, thank you so much. I really
Yes.
appreciate that. It's been a passion of mine, and one of the great satisfactions has been that I was able to tell Clarence Henderson's story. He's passed away, but he has lots of family, grandchildren and great grandchildren who only knew fragments of this story, and that I was able to pass it along to them has been one of the great joys of my writing career. And if anybody wants to talk about it or have me sign a book, I can be had for a cup of coffee. And I'm also easy to find. You can reach me through the ajc.com, or I'm on Twitter at C Joyner. It's Joyner with a Y. I'm happy to sign books or answer questions about the book. And I'm just right here in DeKalb County with everybody else. So.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you so much, Chris. I'm glad to have had you on here, and for taking the time to talk and answer questions and everything. For those of you who are here, this video will be edited and put on YouTube. If you want to watch it again, which I know I will, but definitely check out on our YouTube channel. We have 30, I think this is going to be number 35 or 36 right now, programs that are there that range anywhere from people talking about writing community all the way up to literary agents talking about getting an agent. So there's plenty of free information there for you. All you have to do is go to the Broadleaf Writers Association channel and have at it. But thank you, Chris. Thank you, everybody, for being here. And we will see you all next time.
Thanks
Have a
so
good night.
much. Good night.